Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It is a bit hectic right now. This was supposed to happen in the summer, but of course now we're in the throes of online teaching, so it's been a bit intense. But anyway, this is a welcome break from online teaching right now, so it's good I could do that. So as Taylor mentioned, I wanted to talk to you about marine protected areas today. Some of the work we have done to provide evidence for the design of marine protected areas in Canada and elsewhere, but I'm mostly focusing on Canada today. So we'll start with this figure here, which is from a paper published by Ben Halpern and colleagues in 2008. And what you see here is a global map and color-coded, you see cumulative human impacts on 20 ocean ecosystem types. And what you see here in different colors are, of course, high impacts. And so these were impacts up to 2008 that were quantified at, 2007. And so you can see red and deep orange are the highest impacts, and you can see where those are concentrated near the coast. But we also have a lot of impacts throughout the world's oceans, with a few exceptions. Now, the group redid this in 2013, 5 years later, and only looked at 19 ecosystem types. But nonetheless, they just wanted to see how had we done in the ensuing 5 years. And so what you see here is a different kind of scaling, in that the redder the colors are, the higher the impacts are. But again, we can see that there's some areas that have a lot of impacts, particularly in the North Atlantic and also in the Western Pacific. But what is of particular interest is then they looked at the difference between the two studies. So what had happened over those 5 years? And here what you see is on the top panel, you'll see whether impact is increasing or decreasing. So up to, light yellow, impact is obviously increasing. And so we can see what has happened is all of a sudden the southern equatorial Pacific, Atlantic, and then South Atlantic and Indian Ocean are having an increase in cumulative impact. So places where we're not there before are now being impacted. And in this bottom panel, what you see is the trend, whether the impact was high and increasing between the 5 years or whether it was decreasing. And again, you can see that in most places, really, in the North Atlantic, Western Pacific, Indian Ocean, our impact was actually increasing. So we know that. 2 years ago, the study came out to sort of revisit, if you wish, this type of data and look at where wilderness is remaining. And wilderness was defined as areas where we have minimum human impacts. And so what you see here is a lot of the polar regions are still remaining wilderness and terrestrial habitats. And a lot of the deep sea and anti-polar regions are actually the remaining wilderness, if you will, in the marine environment, in the oceans. But there's a big gap here, big white spots, which is where we actually do not have any wilderness. But what is important, I think, is that in this figure here, you can see the contribution. These are the 20 countries that are listed here, are containing 95% of Earth's remaining wilderness, and the top 5 alone, so up to Brazil, contains 70%. And the reason we put this up here is because we are Canadian, and Canada actually is the second largest holder. And I think this graph here illustrates our responsibility as a country to do something to ensure that this wilderness globally is sustained. So how do we do that on a global scale? Well, I'm sure many of you have heard about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one sort of international tool that we have to manage biodiversity in the world. And so this is an international legally binding treaty that had 3 goals: to conserve biodiversity, to sustainably use biodiversity, and to share fairly and equitably the benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. And so this treaty was signed in 1992, it entered into force in 1993, and 193 parties signed it. So most of the world's states have actually signed this convention, our southern neighbors excluded, as is the case with most international treaties. From that diversity, what followed was what you may have heard as Aichi target. And so these were not on the original treaty, but they came on later. And so they were signed in Aichi, Japan, and there were 20 of them. And some of these are sustainable fisheries, maintaining sustainable fisheries, preventing extinctions, but also this Aichi Target 11, which applies very much to marine protected areas, which is what I'll be referring to a lot for the rest of my talk. I don't know how many of you follow the news, but this is a UN report that came out just yesterday. It was just published yesterday. And it basically said that the world has failed to meet at a global level every single one of those 20 targets. So we're doing really badly. And unless, what they said was that humanity is at a crossroads, and, those targets were set in 2010, and we're nowhere near where we should be in terms of actually doing them. So that is bad news. But you're the next generation. You have an opportunity to make sure that perhaps we will meet those targets in the near future, because it is your world. You're inheriting this world. And so it's in your hands that we trust what we have failed to do. So let's focus on this Target 11. And so this is the one that has to do with protected areas. So according to this target, by 2020, which is about to elapse in 2 months, at least 17% of terrestrial inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas, especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services, are protected through effectively managed, equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas. So what I will do is I'll focus mostly on those elements here that you see in orange. I'll be talking about coastal and marine areas, and I'll be talking about representativity, but mostly about connectivity. So what is a marine protected area? This is actually, if you can imagine, really not a highly contested term. Different countries, different sectors, different times have developed different definitions of marine protected area. You'd think, how difficult could it be? But when lawyers are involved, it has to be very precise so that then it can be defensible from a legal standpoint. So the one that I like is the one that has been put forth by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is also the organization that has developed global conservation standards for marine protected areas. It has over 1,000 members from 170 countries, and actually 24 members are from Canada. So it doesn't have to be just government, it can be NGOs, it can be provincial governments, federal governments, etc. So according to them, a marine protected area is a clearly defined geographical space that is recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So it is important. It's outlined. Everybody knows it's a marine protected area, and it's actually managed as such. So this is the legalese, right? But important. So the IUCN have also put forth, based on the scientific evidence, some of the benefits that have been shown to be provided by marine protected areas, and I'll list some of them here. Not all marine protected areas will provide all of those benefits. For example, include fisheries is a little bit of a red herring. Not all MPAs help fisheries, and it's contentious whether they do at all. But certainly biodiversity conservation, certainly climate mitigation and resilience, these are well accepted benefits from MPAs. But then there's those other aspects that you see further down. These are all for biodiversity related, but also MPAs are important for tourism and recreation. They're important for protecting cultural and spiritual resources. And even it has been suggested that they're good models for fair and open governance. So even from that perspective, they can provide benefits. However, MPAs are only one of the tools that are available to us in wider ocean management. And so this is where, the argument starts with the fisheries people, where they say that MPAs don't work for fisheries, and of course they don't by themselves. So what this graphic here shows is generally, if you're trying to go from a not so healthy to the healthiest ocean from left to right. You go from the wider ocean, which is open to everybody and experiences the heaviest use, all the way over to no-take marine protected areas where you have the highest protection. So again, this is the idea. It's just one tool. And as of 2 years ago, not only was the IUCN not happy with meeting the 10% goal, but they actually proposed that we should try, if we want to really protect biodiversity, we really should up the ante and try for 30%. So that means that 10% should be 30% of the world's coastal and oceans should be protected. Remember, we didn't even meet the 10. Our government, our current government, promised 25% by 2025. But the world has promised or has moving towards a 30 by 30. So how do we select marine protected areas, right? There's certainly, again, the convention provided some clear criteria to actually allow for the selection of marine protected areas. So this could be areas that are unique, rare, they house rare ecosystems, there's something special about them. They may be really important for life history of species. That may be spawning grounds for a fish, or there may be feeding grounds for marine mammals. There may be important habitats for endangered species. There may be areas of high diversity or high productivity, or they just are those wilderness areas that are have high naturalness. So there's a number of criteria that have been selected, and typically any governing agencies refers to some of these criteria to decide whether they will select a location to propose for a marine protected area. So there's the globe, and here is the atlas from the Atlas of Marine Protection, where we were at. This is February 2019. And so what you see here is established in blue, protected areas, and proposed and pretty closely established in those crosshatch colors, blue. And so you can see there's the ocean. It's not exactly a big area that is being occupied by marine protected areas, yet you often will hear a lot of dissent about putting marine protected areas in the water that are going to take away people's livelihoods, and basically they're going to place the ocean beyond use, right? Because it will take the ocean out of play for various industries. Now, that particular group is actually the group that is keeping numbers on marine protected areas, and you hear different numbers from different groups. What these guys are doing is they're actually only counting the protected areas that have actually been legislated. Not, oh, we will propose to put one there, and we don't know, then it has to go through the whole negotiation and consultation process, which means it may or may not come through. It may or may not come through at the right size or the size that's been proposed. So what these people are doing is they're just counting what's there. And so what is there, and this was what was there in, well, I guess I did this, I'm going to take this out, sometime in early 2020, January 2020, all the marine protected areas in the world were 5.3%. Right? That was, only 10 months ago, or not even 10 months ago, and we know the world has shut down since then. So we're not moving forward in this number. Only 1.2% of those are in the high seas. Out of the whole world, only the global ocean, only 0.5% is actually placed under high protection. The rest of them, the remaining 2.8, is some sort of protection, but not total protection. And so you can see here in the colors where those are distributed. And so there's another 1% that are designated but unimplemented. So even if you add this to the 5.3, you're up to 6.4. So this was just a few months ago. This is where we were at. So how is Canada doing? Well, Canada is a little bit complicated because, of course, you have multiple agencies that are responsible for implementing marine protected areas. Fisheries and Oceans Canada is the body that is responsible for overseeing the whole thing and counting, coming up with a bin counting of the percentage. But we also have, you can have the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, which are Oceans Act marine protected areas. Then we have what are called marine refuges, which are not really marine protected areas. They can be counted, but They're a little bit, it's what the IUCN calls other effective area conservation measures, which are a little bit tricky. Parks Canada has the marine conservation areas, environment and climate change, where it's about birds. There's provincial parks, etc. So what you see here is everything that we have from all those agencies amounted to 13.8% in November 2019. And you may think this is great, but a large chunk of those numbers is, for example, this large area here that we see in the Arctic. And there's also these areas in blue. Most of it, as you can see, is this other effective measures and not actual marine protected areas. So other effective measures can help. They can count if they're actually contributing to the conservation of biodiversity, but they're not long-term. Typically in Canada, what they are fisheries closures. So they were closed to protect a particular species from fishing impacts, and then they were evaluated and concluded that, yeah, they can count as this other proportion. So most of what we have here is those other measures, not actual marine protected areas. So it may sound like we're doing great, but, maybe we are, maybe we're not. The thing about marine protected areas is that they're there forever. The thing about fisheries closures is they can turn, they can change, they can open. That's the difference. So those are marine protected areas individuals. What we're all talking about, and we're talking about networks of marine protected areas rather than individual marine protected areas. And so what a network is supposed to be a collection of marine protected areas that work together better than just having a bunch of individual ones. And that is because they fulfill certain criteria. Of course, they have to be MPAs, but the collection of those MPAs have to address these issues of representativity, so that this allows you to protect kelp beds, to protect deep water corals, to protect seagrass beds. And so it allows you that network is supposed to have representative ecosystems for the entire set of ecosystems that you will have, for example, in Canada. You're supposed to replicate ecological features. That is supposed to give you some insurance that, if one of your seagrass beds for some reason dies off, you have another one. So you shouldn't just have one seagrass bed, you should have two seagrass beds, or 3 or 4. And so all these elements here have to do with thinking about the collection of MPAs as opposed to just a bunch of individual MPAs that may not be in any way related. Now, the important element of networks, and this is what I work with and I will focus the rest of my talk on, is connectivity. So the main criterion of networks is to maximize and enhance connectivity between individual marine protected areas, groups of marine protected areas within an area, and networks across regions. So why do we care about that? Here's a network that is very much different now, but that's what it used to look like back in the beginning of March. And so this is the Air Canada network in North America. So this is what happens in winter, right? And this is something that can sort of break down all those linkages that you see, all those different flights that go from one place to the other. And we've all experienced this, all of us that live in this great country of ours. So here's the network again. So let's say a winter storm hits Toronto. All of a sudden, all those flights that are coming in or through Toronto are gone. And we all know what happens when we're stuck in Toronto, right? So Toronto is a central node in this network. And if something happens to Toronto, this is reverberating throughout the country. However, if something happens in St. John's, and I have a lot of good friends in St. John's, but if something happens in St. John's, airport shuts down, the rest of Canada is going to keep going, except perhaps for Labrador. It's not going to affect connectivity. And so those connections are important to maintain to keep the whole system going. And if one of them that is central fails, then the whole system may fail. And so we think about it the same way when we think about networks of protected areas. This is a schematic that a student of mine prepared to sort of illustrate some of the connections that we'll see in the world's oceans. So here we have the open ocean. You can see that there's phytoplankton and other food at the surface. as they die, they start sinking. Fish will feed on those animals. We know that animals move across the ocean to go to find places to spawn. We know the big whales will dive down to kilometers to find food to eat. We know that dead plant will sink to the deeper waters and that will serve food as food in deeper environments where photosynthesis cannot occur. So each one of those arrows is indicating those connections that I was talking about. And so we can think about, if we lose some of those arrows, if we're trying to protect the ocean, if we don't protect some of those arrows, we may actually use some important habitats that we're not thinking about. This connectivity mostly applies in habitats, of course, that are patchy. And so here is an example of patchy habitats. These are seagrass beds. And so you can see that there's gaps between those seagrass beds. Here's kelp beds on the West Coast in California. And you can see that animals need to be able to move from one kelp bed to another. And if you lose all your kelp beds or an important central kelp bed, you may not be able to get animals to move from this one to that one. And of course, this is an aerial view of coral reefs, which again are very highly fragmented and where ecological connectivity is important in ensuring connections between these individual fragments. And so if we want sort of a formal definition of connectivity, it's the process by which genes, organisms, populations, species, nutrients, everything but the kitchen sink moves across distinct entities, like habitats, populations, communities, etc. And so we have different types of connectivity that we talk about. We have what is called structural connectivity, and that looks at the world connections across landscapes, for example, kelp bed to kelp bed. Or we have what are functional connectivities, and I will show you some examples of this in a minute. So here's an ecosystem connectivity that is a functional connectivity. Here's the coast of Nova Scotia. And what you see here is a kelp that has been dislodged from this bay here. It's floating just off St. Margaret's Bay, and this is probably at about 8 meters depth. This is a kelp blade that is sitting at almost 3,000 meters depth that could have only come from this coast. So as the kelps get dislodged, they get carried down slope, if you wish. They land on the seafloor at great depths. They're an important source of food and an otherwise pretty depauperate habitat, and all the urchins just go right there and start feeding. So here's an example of ecosystem connectivity among ecosystems that you wouldn't even think about. They may be connected, that are separated by thousands of meters in depth. And in fact, this is a schematic that shows you some of those connections. And this is a study that did a review of the literature and to find out how different types of habitats that are listed here, near shore, offshore, etc., are connected. How many have these exchanges of materials, of food, etc. And you can see all those arrows are studies that indicate studies that found those connections. So you can see there's multiple connections across multiple habitats of resources. This is food that moves across different habitats, illustrating ecosystem connectivity. But what I work with mostly is population connectivity. And so getting back to those populations or to the systems that are really quite, patchy, what you end up with is, here's the schematic of those patches. And what you have is you have individuals. So this may be fish that swim from one place to the other, or maybe propagules that disperse from one place to the other. And so what you see here in arrows is how the direction of movement across different patches. So you may have patches like this one, which is called a source, and you can see that arrows are leaving this patch at all times. So individuals or their genes or propagules are dispersed from this patch, which it acts as a source to a whole bunch of patches all around. The same with this one in the middle. Whereas this one, or even this one, for example, doesn't export, doesn't have an arrow leaving it. And so this is called a sink because it doesn't produce any connections to the outside. And so you can imagine when we're thinking about my protected area design and we're trying to think, okay, which one of these should I close because I can't protect everything. If you protect this one, you're not going to do very well because everything else is destroyed you save this one, most of the propagules to this one are coming from the outside. So you're not going to be able, you're going to lose this one eventually as well. If on the other hand, you decide to protect this one, you can see that this particular patch can provide propagules, can provide animals to surrounding patches, and therefore can act as a source of biodiversity to the surrounding waters. And so the animals that I work with are marine benthic invertebrates. And so you see a whole bunch of examples there, deep water corals and sea urchins and mussels, kelp, which is a plant, but falls within sort of the category of this same idea of organisms that the adults are attached or move very little. And so what happens with these animals is the way these animals will move, so the way they will form the connection, is through their larval stage. So this is the larvae of these animals that you just saw. They're all planktonic, and they also will spend a few days, they're released from the adults, they spend some time in the water where they develop, and then they spend that, while they're in the water, they're being moved around by currents so they can move from patch to patch, quite large distances. And so this is sort of the motile component of that, the life history of those animals that are attached as adults. And so what a larva will do is, here's an example, it will be released from point A, the adult will spawn the larvae, and so then they will spend some time in the water, they may immediately come back down and find a place which is good for them, and they will attach and then go through physiological changes and turn into mini adults. Or they may spend more time in the water. Here's the direction of the current, so they're getting pushed around by the currents. They may feed or move up and down in the water during the day, down in the day, up at night to avoid being eaten upon. And then at some point, they're going to reach a point where they're going to drop to the bottom and they're going to get an adult and turn into adults eventually. So where do larvae go? How do we measure how larvae go? Larvae are small, they're transparent, they're very dilute. So it's not like you can track it, right? You can't go and say, oh, here's a larva, I'm going to follow it and see if it starts from A, where will it go? So the way we deal with this issue is we use what are called biophysical models. And so these are, you have models that you see here, for example. This is just an example from a study. So these currents, this is Nova Scotia, this is Prince Edward Island, this is the Northumberland Strait. And what these arrows are showing you is the direction of the currents at this particular time and point. And then so this is near the surface and this is near the bottom. And so you can see the arrows differ in magnitude because currents are faster at the surface than they're at depth, 200 meters depth. And so if a larva is at the surface, it will go to different places than if it's at the bottom. And so what you do is you use those currents and you release virtual larvae in this field, and then you follow where those larvae end up. And this is how you can get an idea of where larvae go. And so in this particular example, in the same area, this is larvae for the sea star. And so here is using larvae that are released from an east point on this bay. You can see darker colors indicate that more larvae are found in those locations. And so you can see that when larvae are released from this location, they're going to sort of hug the coast, go around Cape Breton, and then disappear off into the Atlantic Ocean. If, on the other hand, are just released a little bit off to the side here, a little bit to the west, those larvae are going to spill throughout Northumberland Strait. And so this site is very much connected, you can assume very much connected with sites within the Northumberland Strait, whereas this site is not. So again, this gives you an idea of how to draw these connections. And so you can ask questions with those models. Where did the larvae are coming from? What depths are they found? Whether they migrate up and down during the day? How long are they in the water? How fast do they swim? So you can ask the models all those questions. And then those questions will tell you, the models will tell you what, given the conditions, where the larvae are going to end up. So essentially, what you can do with those models is measure the importance of those arrows, these connections. That's what the model allows you to do. Different populations, and then you know whether this is important and this is important, but this is it. Is it really important? So then I will tell you, I'll give you an example of how we have used this type of approach for some work we have done in the Maritime. So this is still in progress. This is the domain of the DFO in the Maritimes, where they're going to put the network of MPAs in. And so here's where we're at. We have in red MPAs, so we have 2 marine protected areas, and then in blue we have those marine refuges that I was talking about that are not really MPAs, but they do offer some temporary protection to biodiversity. I will talk specifically about this area here, Corsair Canyon and Georges Canyon, which is an area that was closed in 2016. That was the original closure, and then now has become part of the blue box. And it was closed as sensitive benthic area because of some of the research that we did there. So we actually went on a cruise in 2014. And for the first time, we used a remotely operated vehicle, which is a little submersible that is attached to the ship by a fiber optic cable that we send to the sea floor. And then we look at what lives there. And so we had never been, nobody had ever been into Corsair Canyon, that box where you saw. And when we landed in Corsair Canyon, this is what we saw. So this spectacular, this is a deep water coral. It's called Paragorgia arborea, or bubblegum coral. And you can see why it's called bubblegum. And some of those corals you can't really tell here, but those corals are a meter to 2 meters in height versus width, which will place them, some of them are going to be hundreds of years old, even 1,000 years old. The largest ones we measured was 3 meters high. And so you can see these laser pointers here are 10 centimeters apart, so we use them for scale. And so you can see, first of all, that these animals are really occur in quite high densities. This is really quite unique. We had never seen this much bubblegum coral in any other part in the Maritimes or Newfoundland. And also you can see how big they are, and that means that they're really quite old. And here's another picture of them. And so when we got off the ship, I basically went straight to DFO and I said, listen, this is a unique area. We have the evidence. We think you should do something to protect it from fishing, which is the main stressor. So what will happen is fishing line will tangle onto those corals, and they will rip them off the wall, and they will die. And so here's another picture. This is a different species of coral. So DFO was actually really quite responsive. And at the time, it took them only 2 years to put that closure that I showed you there in place, which was quite remarkable because this was also the Harper years, which were not particularly environmentally friendly years. But the reason they could do it so quickly is because they didn't use the marine protected area route. They used the sensitive benthic area fishery closure, which you can do really quickly. An average time for closure for marine protected area in Canada is a decade. So things can happen, things can get destroyed before the MPA is actually in place. So then a couple of years ago, a student and I decided to look at whether, what is the connectivity? Okay, so that place is closed, but then what happens if it's a sink, right? So what you see here is a figure with all these orange dots are indicating where we have locations of bubblegum coral. And so then what we did is we used this area as the model domain. Here's Corsair Canyon, and this is Georges Canyon right here. Northeast Channel is another closure. And so this is the boundary, right? This is our border with the US. And so we wanted to see, where do the larvae come from and that end up in Corsair? So we don't care so much about where they go when they leave Corsair, but we want to know how is Corsair Canyon maintained? How are those populations maintained? And so here's some example tracks of larvae that were released in different parts. So this is one that was released from Canada. And these are tracks of larvae, simulated tracks of larvae that were released from other parts. And so here's what we found. We found that where larvae come from depends on what the season is that those larvae are in the water. We actually do not know when the larvae are in the water for this particular coral. We have no idea. And so this is why we ran 3 different seasons: winter, spring, and fall. And so you can see that these figures here show you where the sources are for larvae that end up in Corsair Canyon here. And so if we look at winter, we can see that a significant proportion of larvae are actually coming from Canadian waters and end up in Georges and Corsair Canyon. But if we look at September, for example, most of the larvae are coming from down south. So what does this mean? This means that if this animal is indeed reproducing in the fall, the larvae are coming from the south. And if the south is not protected, if those populations are not protected, then there will be no incoming larvae in Corsair, and that means that eventually the corals in Corsair will die and they will not be replenished. So this is why you need to be thinking about connectivity and thinking about your management measures when you're actually thinking about closures and how effective they are. And so just to give you an example, this is a review study that a student of mine did to try to understand the different ecological criteria that are used in the design of marine protected areas. And you can see a whole list here, but representation is the highest, though up for 100% of the marine protected areas use representation as a criterion in designing marine protected areas. But look at connectivity. Less than 10% of marine protected areas in this Australia, Canada, France, USA, United Kingdom, less than 10% actually considered connectivity when they're designing the marine protected areas. And so, when we looked at the literature to try to understand whether scientists and managers are looking at connectivity the same way, what we found was a big disconnect. So what we found is that what you see in green here is the percentage of studies that look by managers or management plans for marine protected areas that looked at connectivity. And so most of them focused on these two types, demographic and landscape, whereas science looks at different types of connectivity. So there seems to be a disconnect between what us as scientists are studying and what managers are using or need to use for their own needs to design marine protected areas to consider connectivity. And so what Ariana Balber came up with is this proposed framework that allows you to think about how to incorporate connectivity in the design of marine protected areas more effectively so that less than 10% actually becomes quite higher. And so what you see here is in green is what managers have to do. So managers are the ones that come up with the conservation objectives, and then scientists then measure connectivity. Managers and scientists rather identify the conservation objectives that need to consider connectivity. The scientists go out and measure them, and then they come back and they come up with metrics that managers understand and they can use. And so then the managers can decide, oh, okay, I see this metric, I know how you measure that, and I think it's important to include or not. And so this is a cyclic process where you have a constant interaction between managers and scientists trying to understand what connectivity is, how is it measured, and if it needs to be incorporated in your conservation objectives to have your system, your network of marine protected areas be effective. And so what I want to leave you with, however, is this slide here, which is, we always talk about marine protected areas and network designs as being, most of scientists think about really the ecological system and the design principles. So the conventional biological diversity brought up these characteristics, representation, connectivity, replication, all of which are based on the ecology. But then you can see there's a whole bunch of other things that we need to consider when we design networks of marine protected areas, such as governance and management design principles, things like legitimacy, transparency, knowledge integration, and then outside that, of course, we have the societal goals. So unless society decides that, we need to protect biodiversity more than we need to protect a particular livelihood, until those decisions are made, you will never have effective networks of marine protected areas. So it's really a complicated system, and our work really is this little bit here, but we hope it helps. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions.